Okay, so we are officially live on YouTube. Okay, we're good to start. Perfect. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in for our Ask an Expert panel. My name is Chris and I'm the Executive Director for Generation Screwed, the nation's largest nonpartisan student network advocating for intergenerational fairness. And as the youth initiative of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we inherited their fight against big government's legacy of massive debts and wasteful spending so that future generations won't have exponentially higher tax burdens compared to previous ones. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that this event would not have been possible without our student volunteers and the support of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute, or MLI, is Canada's top public policy think tank based in Ottawa. And as an independent, nonpartisan think tank, MLI works to make poor public policy unacceptable in the nation's capital. And with that, I'll leave you in the capable hands of our panel moderator, Daniel Perry. Daniel?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you and Brett from MLI for organizing this, and welcome everyone that is watching on YouTube. Just to give everyone a quick rundown of what today has in store. First, we'll begin by introducing the panelists. Then each panelist has about 10 minutes to give their opening remarks, and then we'll kind of start diving into questions, first from the audience, and if we need some help, I have prepared some to get everyone going, and we'll ask that the responses be between 5 to 10 minutes for each question. And so without any further ado, no one came to listen to me other than my mom, so hi, Mom. We'll start introducing our panelists. So first, we have Mr. Ken Coates. Mr. Coates is Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Senior Policy Fellow in Aboriginal and Northern Canadian Issues. He's also a professor and the Canadian Research Chair in Regional Innovation in the Johnson Jama Graduate School of Public Policy. His areas of interest and bodies of work include regional innovation, university education, and higher education generally, as well as Indigenous rights and land claims and science and technology policies. Next, we have Mr. Philip Cross, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And prior to joining MLI, Mr. Cross spent 36 years at Statistics Canada, specializing in macroeconomics. He was appointed Chief Economist Analyst in 2008 and was responsible for ensuring the quality and coherency of all major economic statistics. He's also a frequent commenter on the economy and interpreter of StatsCan's reports for the media and the general public at large. He's also a member of C.D. Howe's Business Cycle Committee. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Aaron Woodrick, who is the Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And Aaron has the very tough job of keeping politicians accountable for how they spend taxpayers' dollars. And as one of Canada's prominent opinion leaders, Aaron certainly has shaped how Canadians tolerate government spending and the waste that comes from it. A lawyer by training, Aaron has practiced litigation in his hometown of Kitchener, Ontario, as well as corporate law with major international law firms in London, Hong Kong, and Dubai before returning to Canada. In addition to being a recovering lawyer, he's also a recovering partisan, having previously served as a political organizer for several political candidates in both the federal and provincial elections, as well as several leadership campaigns. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Cross. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with, before I was an economist, I also worked a lot in history when I was in university, and I thought it'd be interesting to go back over some of the historical comparisons to what we're going through. You hear the word unprecedented used a lot, but there actually are some interesting precedents for what we're going through now. Just to remind you what we're going through now, I'm going to use the PBO's numbers because frankly, they're the only numbers coming out of the federal government these days. The Minister of Finance has gone mysteriously quiet on how much spending and deficits are going on. So I think the PBO's estimates are credible. They show that spending is projected to jump this year from about 15 to 26% of GDP. That's good in one shot is going to raise the deficit from 1.1% of GDP to about 12.7%. The overall level of the government debt in the economy is going to skyrocket from about 31% to 48%. By the way, these are all likely low estimates. They don't include any of the daily spending plans that have been rolled out since the PBO published these estimates on April 30th. We know, for example, the provinces and local governments are going to be begging for more money. The bailout of airlines hasn't begun, so very much take these as lower bound estimates. The actual result will likely be higher. So we certainly have a very large and swift increase in government spending, largely financed by debt. So look back at previous times, what happened in World War II is this is like the early days of World War II. It's not like when the shooting really got serious in 1942. Then we saw tremendous increases in government spending and debt. But the first few years of World War II were comparable to this. We saw the government debt increase from about 10% of GDP to a little over 20% between 1938 and 1941. But quickly we see some differences too. Back then, all of the increase was federal spending, whereas today, or as in 2008, 2009, you'll see it's no one level of government rolls out all this spending. It's always done jointly because, for example, a lot of infrastructure programs, the federal government will finance, but it's the provinces and local governments that actually do the spending. Whereas the federal government in World War II was uniquely responsible for national defense. So they just took over the whole area, kicked everybody out of the way, and did all the spending and took on all the debt. The amount of debt they took on was spectacular. Federal debt during World War II went from 22% of GDP to 160% of GDP. That's just way beyond anything that's even imaginable today. We were running annual deficits during World War II of 23% of GDP compared to 13% that's projected in the current circumstance. And we were running deficits of over 20% year after year later in the war. So, today isn't exactly comparable with the huge increase in debt, yet it's instructive that we did survive. We won the war. We got the deficit under control after. It's instructive to look at how the government got the deficit and debt under control after the war. They didn't really have a plan. They started to pay it down. They ran surpluses for 5 years after the war, but that only amounted to about 13% of GDP. And yet they were able to reduce the GDP debt ratio by almost 90 percentage points in a decade. Now, only 10% of that was repayment. So how did they do it? Well, mostly we had incredible income growth. The 1950s had explosive growth in GDP, and it was the rapid growth of GDP that made the debt manageable. But that's unlikely to be repeated in our lifetime. There were very specific things to the 1950s why we had very rapid growth. We had 20 years literally of pent-up demand after the Depression and the war. People had a lot of demand. There was a great deal of productivity and innovation going on, even in the 30s, which we think of as a lost decade, but there was a lot of productivity and technical increases. So we had both the demand and the supply. We had the beginnings of rebuilding the global economy, the start of globalization. So there were a lot of reasons, things that were fueling the economy that we haven't been able to duplicate since. So it's much more likely that we're not going to be able to count on rapid GDP growth to bring down the debt. So it's much more likely that we're going to have to pay it down with the kind of slow grinding austerity that we used in 95 and again after the 2008 recession. So when we look at how we paid down the debt during those periods, it's instructive that almost all of it was, well, all of it in 2008, 2009 after that recession was a reduction in spending. In fact, there was a slight reduction in taxes, but almost entirely the deficit was eradicated after the 2008 recession by bringing down spending. The 1995 debt crisis in Canada was mostly met by lower spending. It was about 75% spending cuts and about 25% tax increases. economists generally like to bring down debt by spending cuts rather than tax increases, because tax increases tend to lower economic growth and efficiency. So that's the preferred way of bringing down the debt. So looking forward, by the way, I should note too that in both instances, in the 90s and again after 2009, we were able to bring down the deficit, and yet economic growth was sustained. The two are not opposed to each other. In fact, in the 90s, we ended up with a booming economy by the late 90s. So I think the lesson there is that coming out of this crisis, we're going to want to adopt austerity, and we particularly want to focus on spending cuts going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. And I would like to turn it over next to Mr. Coates.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and all those who are sort of joining in. It's great to be on this very interesting panel. I'm going to focus my comments. Philip goes after the macro level. I'm going to sort of bring it down to the question for young people, the issues of generation screwed and how you might sort of fit into all of this. We've got this pandemic is going to have reverberations over the next, I think, the next 15 to 20 years, assuming that things don't get worse in other quarters as we sort of go along. The grade 12 experience in Canada has been substantially undermined. The young people going off to post-secondary institutions this fall will be the least well-prepared generation probably in history. You've lost about 40% of your grade 12 year. It's going to be clear the grade 10s and 11s is going to show a sort of sizable sort of impact as well. At universities, the same thing has happened. They've lost about a quarter of the year as well, quarter of the semester as well. Post-secondary education is now shifting almost entirely online. They got a few institutions pretending they're going to open up face-to-face in the fall. They will open up primarily for professional programs, law, medicine, that sort of thing, and also for graduate studies. But it also means that the first year experience will be largely online. What do we know about that? We know that we don't know very much. Online learning is extremely difficult. It requires extremely high level of motivation, and also has very high dropout rates. So people going to school, colleges, universities, polytechs will have very great difficulty this year, and we're likely to see both a decline in enrollment, but also a sharp rise in dropout very quickly. So then, of course, this sort of begs the question, what do I do? Well, I can take a gap year. Well, you're not going very far. It's not. You might be able to stay in your own province, but most people take a gap year so they can get away from their mom and dad. It's going to be really hard this year. We're looking at the worst job market in generations. So staying away from school and getting a job is likely to produce anything more than minimum wage work. There'll be a fair bit of that, but that's not going to be a great issue. But the long-term prospects are also being undermined, and I think it's something we need to think about very, very carefully. Students who graduate into depression, or recession, whether they graduate from high school or university, basically take years, sometimes decades to recover. In fact, they really never recover. They don't get full-time jobs on an early basis. They don't start contributing to pension funds. They have real trouble getting their feet underneath them. And it does take decades to sort of recover very quickly. In this case, and Philip hinted at this, the recovery is going to be very, very unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. We pretend we do, but we don't. And I think it could happen fast. People have talked about the V-shaped recovery and crash fast and rise up. Well, don't get your fingers gambling on that one. That one's really unlikely. The chance of this being a quick recovery are very small. The chance of it being a prolonged one with multiple sort of dips or downward are very strong. As Phillips has described, the government has gambled its bullets. Basically, it's taken a 6-shooter and used 5 of the bullets already on the first wave, hoping we could get through this without a major crisis. They basically hasn't got very many bullets left. If there is a second wave, and you see the kind of developments that are occurring even in South Korea, where a second wave has started up that's almost as bad as the first, see what's going on in the United Kingdom, we're not well prepared for that. You can't keep doubling down forever the kind of way the government has done. And my broader concern for us to sort of ponder is, I think also that our society appears to have entered into this crisis in a me first mode. Philip did a great job of describing our reaction in World War II, but that was a global crisis. The thought of Nazi and Japanese and Italian sort of hegemony around the world terrified people. It was a full-on total war effort. People sort of got behind their government with savings bonds and voluntary restraint and things of that sort. Right now, our society is very much in a what's in it for me mode. The number of people who applied for government benefits is absolutely through the roof. My own estimate is that in the fall, we're going to see that about 20 to 25% of the people who got those funds were not done appropriately. We'll have lots of charges of fraud. The government's opened a snitch line, which, if that's their first line of defense, shows you that they weren't prepared for this. In my world, and you all can see that I'm an older person, what's really interesting is the government made a very large concession to seniors and sent them all a check for $300. In my friend circles, they're laughing about this and talking about how ridiculous the government is giving away money to people who don't need it. So one of my friends makes $120,000 a year in his retirement sort of situation. His expenses are about $30,000 a year. He's trying to decide what kind of scotch he's going to buy. And he's going to thank the government for wasting that money on him. So I think I'm very concerned that we do not have a national spirit behind the kind of recovery that we need, where it's sort of all hands on deck and everybody pulling together. I don't see that commitment. So for young people in this, there's requirement for sort of a personal post-COVID recovery plan. How do individuals react to this, and how do you react to it as a generation? Collectively, what is your response? Do you go on to advanced education right away and take a chance on online learning? Do you go for jobs? Well, what jobs and at what pay? What fields of study? We can talk about that a bit later on, perhaps. I will tell you this, that post-secondary education, the returns are declining quite dramatically. In fact, 30% of people who enter post-secondary education will drop out in the first year. Only half of those people who actually continue to a degree, continue on their studies, will actually graduate. So that's not a great number. And only half of those who graduate, this is mostly American data, only half of those who graduate will actually end up with a job that they couldn't have gotten out of high school. So that is not the format we've been sold. We've been promised many, many times that you invest in yourself, you'll get a great return. If you happen to end up as a doctor or a lawyer or a certain kind of engineer, that's great. Part of the problems is twofold. Number one, that your success is largely determined by your family's income, and your personality. When I was at the University of Victoria many years ago, we tried to figure out what's the best way of determining who's going to be a successful student. The answer was their parents' postal code. That's not exactly what you sort of have been told by the university and college system. It's also really hard to pick the right field. So what do you do? Where do you go? 5 years ago, people were told to get into energy. And we produced an enormous number of engineers who were specialized in different aspects of the energy production, oil and gas development, and things of that sort. Those jobs have disappeared by the tens of thousands. And the lucky people are finding jobs overseas. The unlucky ones are sitting at home unemployed. Now we're being told it's healthcare and high technology. I would be very careful. Healthcare, most of the jobs are going to be sort of entry-level jobs. We're going to need fewer doctors rather than more doctors because of new technological innovations. And the high-tech jobs, are very flexible and very unreliable as we go forward. So my challenge back to you as Generation Screwed, and to all of us as we sort of think about your future and our future together, is what is our vision? And do we have a vision? When the government's not given us one, our provincial governments have not given us one. Are we going to maintain the high level of government dependence? I think the answer is that's what people expect, but I think we cannot do that. Are we going to return to a gig economy, sort of short-term, part-time, precarious employment? Absolutely, that will be the core area of growth and development. We've been promised about the new economy I was a Dean of Arts at University of Waterloo for 5 years, wonderful place. Everybody thought the whole world was going to be like by Waterloo Regent, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge. Is the new economy going to dominate? I'm not so sure. Canada's not very good at this. We basically take our best minds and export them. We underinvest in new startups and have trouble getting them building up to scale. So if you're counting on a new high-tech job, basically count on moving. You may end up in Japan, you may end up in Korea and Singapore, you may end up in Norway or Finland or someplace like that, but we're not very good at this. So the challenge is what kind of future are we going to have? And I'll say one comment. We are seeing a very rapid decline in rural society and in small town Canada. Those economies are extremely vulnerable. And what we're having instead is the development of a city-state economy, where we're going to have 5 or 6 major cities that will continue to dominate. Those 5 or 6 major cities produce more than 100% of new jobs in Canada before the pandemic. They'll do even more in the recovery because the federal government is very focused on urban renewal, and there's good reasons for that. That's where a lot of people live and where the political power is located. But what kind of economy do we want small towns to flourish? We want rural areas to have economic opportunity. I've left you with more questions than answers. These are troubled times.
Turning that light up just for a second to see what happens.
Well, thank you very much for that, especially because I know we have a lot of high school students on the call right now, as well as some graduates like myself that are in the job market. So before we turn it over to questions, I just want to remind everyone that the YouTube chat is open. If you have any questions you want to ask our panelists, feel free to post them there and we'll get them to it. And Aaron, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And thanks for all of you tuning in. I know that I guess a lot of us are looking for a stimulus these days, and hopefully you're finding this discussion at least marginally stimulating. I wanted to go back a bit and sort of touch on some of the things that Philip touched on at the outset, just to give people an idea, especially younger people who might not have any sense of just how big our problems are, how much money is being spent. Most regular people are used to dealing with numbers in the hundreds and the thousands, not in the billions and millions and trillions. And so I just wanted to put some numbers on the table so that people have some sense of exactly where we are, or where we were right before this crisis, where we are now, and where we're probably going. So speaking of the federal budget in particular, the last federal budget we had, the one that was supposed to happen in the spring, has been postponed indefinitely. In 2019, the federal budget was $355 billion. That was the total amount of money that the federal government was spending in that fiscal year. And the deficit was $20 billion. So they were $20 billion short on the 355. During this pandemic alone, so in the last 2.5 months, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has estimated that there's at least 145 billion in new unplanned spending. So you can see the scale of it is substantial. It's already equivalent to about half of everything we spend in a regular year. And that's just in 2.5 months. And that's completely unplanned spending. So it's a substantial amount of money. That's actually only up to date as of a month ago, because the Parliamentary Budget Officer just kind of gave up trying to track the spending announcements because there are so many. So suffice to say, we are spending a lot of money that we never planned to spend. And the deficit now, it was supposed to be $20 billion. Now the low end estimate is more than 10 times that. It's 252 billion. And I'm willing to bet that we're going to be north of 300 billion by the time this is all over. So you can see that the challenge that we're facing is of a size that we have not seen, certainly in our lifetimes, maybe not completely unprecedented, as Philip said, but certainly not something we've ever seen in normal times. Now, the other question, and this is something that I do like to mention to students, because a lot of us who are older, we just sort of take it as a given that when you say that debt is a problem, that you'll know why debt is a problem. A lot of people say, well, why does it matter to me? I don't see this in my day-to-day life. It doesn't seem to affect me, so why should I worry about it? And the way I like to explain it to students is that you just need to think of it in terms of math. In the same way that you, if you borrow on a credit card or you borrow $20 from a friend, any money that you get in the future, you have right off the top, you have to take that $20 and give it back. And governments, even though they are not people in the sense that they live forever, they do still have to pay, at the very least, interest on the money they borrow. And that interest, when you're talking billions of dollars, starts to add up pretty quickly. So to give you another example of just how much borrowing costs us, before this crisis, in the last budget, the federal government spent, the year before, they spent $22 billion on interest payments on the debt. Now, $22 billion is about as much money as we spend on our military every year. So it's a lot of money. And that's money that, of course, we then could not spend on anything from roads to hospitals to schools to all the sorts of things you normally expect that tax revenue is going to pay for. So this is a lot of money that we're foregoing. And the only silver lining right now is that interest rates are very low. So borrowing is not very expensive. The problem is they are not going to stay low forever. And all you have to do is ask someone who's a little bit older who had to buy a house in the 1980s or 90s, and interest rates right now you can get a mortgage for 2 or 3%. Back then you could be paying 10, 15% for a mortgage, and you can imagine it becomes a lot harder to make ends meet when you're paying that much money in interest. So I mean, the basic point is that governments really need to be mindful of intergenerational fairness. Most parents wouldn't borrow money in their child's name and then leave their kids to deal with it when they pass away. And governments should not do the same. We're not talking about things like building a bridge. If you build a bridge and it lasts for 100 years, you can argue that future generations get to use it. But that's not what most governments spend money on. They spend money on programs and services that are being consumed today, being consumed right now, which means people who are still very young, or certainly not our children or grandchildren, they're never going to get to use those things or benefit from them, even though they're the ones that are paying for them. I mean, the obvious question I get asked is, well, how did we get here? How is it this bad? Why do politicians behave this way? And when you think about it, it just has to do with political incentives. Politicians are elected by the people who can vote today. They don't get votes from people who are not born yet. And so they have every incentive to make people who are voting today happy by offering them more stuff without them having to pay for it. And so we get trapped in this vicious cycle that leads to politicians spending, but not raising enough money to pay for it. And I think that's a reason that people will have different perspectives on what the right size of government is. I'm someone who tends to believe a smaller, more focused government that does a few important things very well is better than a government that tries to do too many things and doesn't do any of them well. But whatever we agree on, we should agree that government should have a way to pay for whatever it is they're promising now, so that we don't start kicking the can down the road and we don't start putting the burden on people who aren't even born yet, because that's just not fair. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention before going to the questions is to just talk a little bit about the nature of the downturn. I think as Ken had mentioned, there was talk, I think, early on of what they call a V-shaped recovery, where you sort of put the economy in sort of suspended animation, then it just sort of bounces back. Or as Philip had mentioned, that with pent-up demand, during the war, that everyone would just sort of spend on all the things that they had been hoping to spend on before but couldn't. I think it's hard to find someone who believes that's going to happen now, and part of that speaks to how different this situation is, even than things like a war or a natural disaster. I think with a war, with a natural disaster, there's a clear ending. When you've won the war. When the earthquake is over. The problem with what we're fighting right now is we are essentially fighting a lot of unknowns and a lot of fear, and that even if we open the economy tomorrow, if we just threw open the doors and said everything is allowed, you're still going to see a lot of people very scared, very reluctant. People are not going to take vacations. They're not likely to go to music concerts or hockey games or other places where there's a lot of people. And so the idea that people are just going to turn around and spend all the money that they haven't been spending the last few months is probably not going to happen. And that creates some new challenges. It's a lot easier for the government to put the economy into a coma and to sort of temporarily keep people afloat with borrowing money. The real challenge is going to be how to jolt the economy back to life. And there's going to be a very big debate about what governments can do to just sort of spur the economy back to life. And certainly at the CTF, we're concerned that they're going to try what they've always tried, which is to just spend money they don't have, which hasn't really worked very often in the past, to be honest. So we're concerned that will be the approach they take now. And we'll certainly be out there trying to push for some more outside the box thinking on how we can get the economy back, combined with some reductions in government spending. We can get the budget back to balance and stop piling up the debt on the backs of future generations.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And we actually have a question already in the live feed about this. So let's dive right into it. It's open to anyone that wants to answer it. So the question reads as follows: is the increase in public debt to cushion the economic blow from COVID worth it? And how could the government have acted differently so the debt wasn't so bad in the first place? So who wants to answer that? Go ahead.
Worth it. I'll let Aaron answer that part. I'll say it probably was largely unavoidable in the short term that we're in this situation where people very quickly, almost overnight, lost their income. And we lost about $400 billion of income if you look at the drop in GDP. And lo and behold, the combined increase in government deficits of federal, provincial, local, when all this is over, is likely to be around $400 billion. So what governments have largely done is they've replaced that income replaced most of that income that people lost. That probably is, a reasonable first response to this crisis. This isn't the fault of ordinary people. They lose their job. And by the way, too, we're trying to keep people where they are. We're trying to keep them, we don't want people, we want them to stay with their employer, to stay in the industry they were. The hope is that when we reopen, the restaurants will all start up, the hotels, and everyone will go back to work. We didn't want people wandering the streets looking for jobs. So in the short run, this is probably an appropriate response, but it's clearly unsustainable. It doesn't address the longer term problems. Is it worth it? I'll let Aaron take that one.
Sure. Thanks, Phil. Look, I would say two things. First of all, I agree with Philip. I don't think there was any other way than what had happened. You can quibble with little things the government did, but I'm willing to cut them a lot of slack because this is a truly unforeseeable situation in terms of policy response. And it's hard to see that they could have done much less. So I think a lot of the spending was necessary. You can quibble at the margins. Two things, though. One is that the situation that they put themselves in before this, if the Trudeau government had saved for a rainy day, if they had not been running deficits for years before, there would have been a lot more money in the war chest. I mean, assuming, say, we spend $400 billion on efforts to sustain ourselves through this, a quarter of that we might have had already had the Trudeau government not been running deficits for the last 5 years. So we were in a weakened position to start because the Trudeau government broke its own promises and did not balance budgets like they promised to. The other thing that I'm concerned about is, and Phil touched on this with the unsustainability, in the short term, paying people to stay home is something you need to do when there's no work to do and you need to help them survive. Once we start reopening the economy, there's a different set of incentives that come into play because now you're paying people to stay home when what you want is them to go back to work. And I know some people have quibbled about saying, well, the CERB isn't that much money. Well, if you look at the minimum wage end, if you're a minimum wage employee, the CERB is only a few $100s short of working full time at a minimum wage for a month. So you're essentially faced with a choice. Would you like to work full time for a whole month for essentially only a couple $100 extra? And you can see how there would be some people that would say, you know what, I'd rather just take the money and not work. And that's the challenge with some of these programs is they were fine for the short term, but they need to be changed or wound down. Otherwise, we're going to have a very different problem on our hands once the sort of immediate shutdown is over.
What I'll add to that is, based on Ken's comment, is there certainly was the opportunity for fraud and abuse in CERB. Announcing ahead of time, no questions asked, was probably too open. They should have said, very few questions asked, but if you take advantage of our generosity, if you take advantage of Canadians in this situation, you will be punished just like we punish price gougers. And instead they just threw the gates open and said, come and get it. That was probably too open. And it would be very interesting to see how much fraud and abuse was involved in this program. I hope Ken's wrong at 2025, but I wouldn't be surprised if we got at least 10 or 15.
Which is a scary number. So
yep.
that's not a good number at all. And the reason I say it's so high is because of all the people that I know who are taking advantage of the system and asking about how to cheat the system. This is very upsetting. Let me make a couple of really quick observations if I could. You asked the question of was it necessary? Remember that the alternative to not doing anything was panic and desperation. When the economy started to shut down, you start losing thousands and thousands and millions of jobs. Governments are partly looking at the economic outcomes, but also saying, how do we keep people sort of not going crazy? And the mental health outcomes of the pandemic are going to be bad enough as they are. But if we had people sort of panic selling their houses and panic selling their cars and all that sort of stuff, we would be in desperate circumstances. But let's also sort of look quickly and think about who is it unfair for? And I think it's very unfair for the private sector. And therefore, it's actually overly generous for the public sector. Public sector people are not very many of them are losing their jobs. And they haven't had very many sacrifices. And I put myself in this category. I'm a university professor. My salary has continued unabated. I've moved all my work to at home, and I'm doing my teaching and stuff online. We haven't been asked to sacrifice anything except we're saving money and not driving to work. and mixing some social things. But the private sector has been hammered. And coming out of this, we are going to see an absolute catastrophe for small businesses. And in our city in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan generally, every day is full of, there's stories coming out of this small business been in operation for 40 years. They're not going to reopen. This restaurant's closing down. Estimates vary all over the place, but about 25, 30% of small businesses will go under. We're seeing, in particular in the United States, the closure of massive chains. And I think we have to think far more about that. The whole question of sort of what's going to happen what's going to happen at the small business area, and what are we going to do to support it? And I'll just use one example that really affects a lot of young people. The total collapse of the tourism industry is absolutely catastrophic. Airlines aren't running and things of that sort. That's really serious. We're going to see hotels. The big hotels in Toronto will probably be okay. They're chain operations and whatever. But I'll tell you, there's a whole bunch of small hotels in rural Canada, small town Canada, that are basically never going to reopen. Restaurants are closing by the dozens all over the place. And so, did we have to do it? We had to do something. I'm not sure. In retrospect, we always would have done something a bit different. But now the question is, how do we change mid-course? And what do we do to make sure that these small businesses have a chance to prosper? Because they are the main job creators in this country in the long term.
And that kind of leads me to a question I had when I was kind of preparing for this, especially talking with a lot of students. They kind of feel stuck between a rock and a hard place because most of us can't find jobs in the current economy, and we have no real choice but to go on serve. And it is a great incentive and a great support system. But the reality is that it's going to have to change very soon. And how can the government start to wean people off of these services and help businesses as they're shut down?
So I'll jump in really quickly if I could. That's a really, really great question. And it's sort of something I spent a lot of time thinking about. We lost a huge opportunity. And this was something that I know government people were thinking about a little bit. Rather than just giving out checks, you could have created tens of thousands of workplace opportunities for young people to get experience. People just graduating from high school, and particularly those graduating from college and university, they're discovering that a credential isn't enough, that they actually need to show they've done something, they worked for somebody doing something. These same small businesses are desperately short of people. They have enough revenue coming in. They can't hire young people that they actually need, even if the need is to do long-term market development and long-term recovery sort of preparations. We could have taken the same amount of money we gave to CERB and taken about a quarter of that and allocated it to work study positions so that people in your situation could have been hired into a job that actually is a resume builder and an experience builder. And it's kind of unthoughtful. I mean, yes, it would have taken a bit of time to do this, but quite frankly, if you'd given the money directly to companies and say, here's some money, make sure you hire somebody new. Anyway, that's, on we go. I think we lost an opportunity to do so. We can change mid-course and turn those CERB payments into work placements as we help small business and young people at exactly the same time.
And kind of building off of that, because in your recent paper for MLI, Performance Anxiety, Post-Secondary Education, and the Future of the Workforce, you kind of mentioned the mismatch between skill sets that are available for students through school and then the needs of the employers. Do you mind just kind of touching on a little bit more and talking about how students can prepare themselves for the job market, especially during the downtime?
So this is a really fascinating and important question that has no easy answer to it. Number one, we're actually right now importing very large numbers of temporary foreign workers to fill jobs that young people won't take. And so a lot of these are really hard jobs in the agricultural sector, plant picking and things of that sort. But it's kind of odd that we're having this conversation where what jobs for young people here, but jobs that are unfilled over there. And we're seeing this in the fishing plants in the Maritimes and stuff as well. So I make a series of quick observations. First off, that there's it's quite clear that employers are not impressed with all the credentials. We produce a very large number of credentialed people, too many. So the very best ones are sort of swamped out by mediocre ones who have the same credential but don't have the same ability. So I made a couple of observations. Know yourself as an individual. One of the worst lies we tell our young people is you can be anything you want to be. That's not true. I would have been a professional baseball player my entire life, but I'm nowhere near the skill set. I would not. But we throw that line around as though it's true. Universities are full of people who came there because they're going to be doctors, and you can tell them day one, only 2% of you are going to become doctors. You haven't got a hope in this. It's a very small chance you're going to go and do that. So what skills? Entrepreneurship, sell yourself. Entrepreneurship is not about starting a new business and getting a new technology to market. It's actually about being able to sell something. And the first thing you have to sell is yourself. And the second thing is you do have to be an innovator, but you can do it inside an organization, inside a company. You have to show that you're creative and flexible. How do you do that? I'm really distressed by young people's lack of reading. The fact that they do not read and don't stay up in current affairs. People say, oh, well, the young people are keep getting their news from Facebook. No, they're not. They're getting their news from Instagram and their friends, and it's mostly about their dresses and their clothes and their eating habits. Young people generally are extremely ill-informed about the world. They know next to nothing about Asia. Every Canadian should be make almost a full-time study of what's going on in East and South Asia. That is our future. We don't understand that now. It's not America and it's not Europe. It's going to be Asia, I think. And we have to understand the global technological changes. Like, what is actually happening down? What's artificial intelligence going to do? So, for example, artificial intelligence is going to take away a lot of jobs for accountants. It's already done that. If you think back to people the age of myself and Philip, who are now closing in on 100 years of age, we used to do our own taxes with pens and paper and all that kind of stuff. Now with instant tax, you don't even go and get help anymore. You can do it yourself in a matter of hours. And so technology is going to change a whole bunch of things. And you have to be an observer of technology and figuring out where it's going. You have to be technologically proficient. And here again is something I'm sad to say. Young people are incredibly inefficient at technology. They can post something on Instagram, do something on Facebook, but if you go anywhere further than the sort of the top 5 skills on any particular website, actually they're not very good at that. Including things like doing research and actually finding jobs and things of that sort. Technological proficiency is very, very important. I'll end with two other observations on how you sort of plan for the future and where you go. Do pay more attention to polytechnics. Polytechnics, their programs are tied into the workplace. They talk to employers and say, we need 47 more heavy equipment operators, and they develop 47 heavy equipment operators if they don't produce 450 of them. Because the employers will say, now you've caused us a problem because we're getting inundated with applications we don't need and don't want. And the other one is experiential education. In fact, we used to call it getting a job. And many of the jobs that young people sort of had available to them, from paper routes to painting houses and mowing lawns, those are actually taken over by small companies now and previously employed people who are looking for something to pay their bills. So we've actually frozen young people out of the job market at the early stages, the 13, 14, 15-year-olds who used to do work. It's really astonishing how we've created very few pathways into the workforce for them. So you have really got your work cut out for you, and do not listen to people who tell you it's going to be easy and obvious and you can be anything you want to be and that everything will be okay. Because, we have not left everything okay. And there are serious challenges ahead.
That's very interesting to say that, especially as now a graduate of university recently. And I'm kind of thinking about that, especially in the AI track, because Alberta in particular has done some very interesting, very innovative movements there to kind of help progress that in terms of the economy. But when I kind of think about the West, I kind of think about the recovery that they went through during the last recession for the past decade. And this came from the comment section here. I kind of want to turn it over to everyone here on the panel. Is what do you think we as in the Canadian government have done wrong in the last recovery, and what can we learn from that, especially when it applies to the West?
Well, I'll jump in first. I think that there is a fatal conceit with governments that if they just try hard enough, they're going to have a better crystal ball than everybody else. And I really fear that. And don't get me wrong, I think they're well-intentioned. I think every government, comes into office and thinks we're going to figure this one out, and we're going to invest in all the right areas, and everything's going to be great. And surprisingly, they can't get it right. And it's not because they're not trying; it's because they don't have anywhere near as much information or incentive as people who have skin in the game do. And so, my fear is that coming out of this particular crisis, the government is going to double down on what it sees as being, the magic bullet. One obvious example is the green. We hear the green economy, green technologies. We know that this is politically popular. It sounds great. It sounds clean. It sounds futuristic. The problem is it may not be viable in the marketplace, and the government may start diverting very scarce resources into ventures that have no hope of surviving in a real economy. So my fear is that the government is going to double down essentially on an industrial strategy that they've been pursuing for 50 years. The targets change, but the goal is always the same: is we're going to pick a few important things, spend a whole bunch of tax money on that, and hope that it works out. And then when it doesn't work out and we're left with the bill and no jobs, people have thrown their hands up and said, well, what happened to the promised land that you were going to deliver to me? So I fear that's where we're going. I and others are going to be suggesting there might be some alternative approaches we can take that sort of unleash the marketplace a little more rather than try and steer it where the government thinks that it needs to go.
Yeah. I think what the government did wrong in the last recovery was, and it's still a problem today, is they continue to confuse the sources of long-term and short-term growth. They always worried about what was going to happen to growth next quarter, next month. And as a result, it was just constant stimulus. It was low interest rates. It was government borrowing, spending, and they never focused on the long-term determinants of growth, which are often exactly the opposite of what you do to stimulate the economy in the short term. In the long term, you want savings. You want investment. You want to encourage business creation and startups, which have fallen sharply over the last 10 years. You want innovation and entrepreneurship. And we haven't done any of things. You want to reduce interprovincial trade barriers. We've proven completely incapable as a country of doing that. We sit here and whine that, globalization is retreating and so on. We have no reason to complain. We can't even arrange trade between Ontario and Quebec. So we shouldn't be complaining about the rocky state of relations between China and the US. So that's my concern, is we continue to focus on short-term goals and we ignore what's good for the economy in the long term. And the two are often exactly the opposite.
My two really quick bit added here is that in Western Canada, if the government does not sort of back off a little bit on its constraints on the oil and gas sector and doesn't make sure that those pipelines that are under development actually proceed, I'm very nervous about the long-term viability of big parts of the Western Canadian economy. Conversely, if in fact, as appears as possible, that we see a Coastal GasLink going ahead and Trans Mountain Pipeline going ahead, we could end up seeing some very, very important developments happening that would stimulate the economy again. So hard to know exactly what else you can do. I hear people talking about, I love the comments about the green economy. We've been overselling that for 25 or 30 years now. We talk about the knowledge economy. Alberta did invest very heavily in artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and other things of that sort. And without getting the long returns that they hoped for, because they were trying to gamble and bet on sort of where the economy was going. I think what you need to do is figure out where is the economy going and attach yourself to it. And that requires far more attention to Asia than we're currently giving it, and far more understanding of the technological futures that lie ahead of us.
It's kind of interesting that you mentioned about the barriers to interprovincial trade, because prior to COVID, that was an ongoing issue. Like, for instance, you're not even allowed to bring beer across borders anymore, which presents a real challenge for a lot of the college students, especially those living in Ottawa. But when it comes to this new normal we're talking about, do you think it's time, and this is open for anyone that wants to weigh in, that we develop a new national strategy that can help us move past these problems of government meddling in provincial issues to interprovincial trade issues to, as well as just not being competitive on the national front? And what steps would we have to take, especially from a fiscal perspective, to kind of get this started?
Well, that is the conundrum of Canada. I mean, we saw in World War II that that was the arrival of the federal government. In the 1930s, the level of government that spent the most money in this country was local government. They were bigger than provinces, bigger than the federal government. The federal government was nothing until World War II came along. That was the big coming out party for the federal government. But since then, it's every recession, it's been a joint federal provincial coordination. We are the most decentralized federation amongst the big G7. We have the weakest federal government. And it's very difficult to see how you can ever sell in provinces like Quebec and Alberta a message of allowing a strong reaffirmation of the federal government into things that are written into the Constitution. God knows how we can never change the Constitution in this country. So it might be a laudable goal, but I don't know how you ever implement it.
Yeah, I think that the window of opportunity may have been missed because I think Philip's absolutely right when he talks about interprovincial trade barriers. That's low-hanging fruit. If that's not something that we can actually achieve, I mean, we're just talking about free trade and commerce between Canadian provinces. This is not. There's no globalist angle. There's no concern about international trade. This is just about a contractor in Manitoba being able to go to Saskatchewan, or someone who works who's licensed in Quebec working in Ontario, or vice versa. These are very simple things, and I think we may have missed our chance because, as we've seen in some cases, Ontario is a good example. During this pandemic, Ontario just started allowing businesses to deliver alcohol. That was never allowed. There was always a huge concern about red tape, and they just said, you know what, it's a crisis, we need to help business, we're going to let them start. You can now get beer delivered to your house from a restaurant. This was this revolutionary thing that we could never do. We did it. It's been great. The sky hasn't fallen. I fear that there still may be time because we're in the middle of this crisis, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic. Maybe that's something we can put on the table in the coming months and say, listen, we need every option that we have right now to get the economy going. This has got to be low-hanging fruit. We should just allow free movement of goods, people, and services between the provinces.
Shifting gears kind of a little bit and talking more about debt and government spending, I have a question here from a viewer. Debt poses a serious long-term problem, but raising taxes will cause long-term economic pain. What is better right now, stimulated growth with tax cuts, or starting to reduce the deficit with higher taxes?
Oh, I'm biased on that question. I work for an organization that pushes for lower taxes, but it's a fair question because historically, again, unsurprisingly, I agree with Philip that every time we've had a deficit, and most of the international examples are in accordance with this too, it is better and less damaging to close that deficit with reduced government spending. That is the better way to go rather than tax cuts. It doesn't damage the economy. The reduction in government spending is frankly not noticed in a lot of quarters. But in this case, we're facing a deficit that's so large that even with very large reductions in government spending, it's not going to be enough to close the gap. So I think there's two sides to it. We have to both reduce government spending, and that speaks to something that Ken had pointed out earlier on. And I'm actually encouraged that even people in government in Ottawa, I have heard making noises that they know that spending cuts are coming. And I've never heard that before. I've never heard public sector union leaders or a former clerk of the Privy Council predicting that government will be smaller in a few years. I'm shocked, but pleased to see that even they recognize that it is not going to be acceptable to most Canadians who work in the private sector, that they should bear all the pain of this and that the public sector should bear none. So that's one half. The short answer is I think it may be time to consider whether or not sort of dramatic, radical tax reform in the short term might be worth the price of deficits for a little bit longer, because it'll be, in other words, if we sacrifice a little bit of tax revenue now, say, for example, we eliminated the small business tax rate for a year or 2 years, we'd have to forego all that revenue. First of all, there's not that much revenue there to begin with because those businesses are struggling, but it could make a big difference to a lot of businesses that are trying to get back on their feet. And frankly, it's a lot better problem for government to have in a couple of years if they have to cool off a really hot economy than trying to fire an economy up. We've seen how easy it is for a government to put the economy into a coma. It's a lot harder to wake it up again. And I think we really need to look at some more radical tools than we've ever considered in the past to make that happen.
I just really quickly jump in and say I agree completely. And I think we have not given enough thought to sort of how our tax system affects people. It affects their investments, their behavior, and things of that sort. One of the crises in Canada, and it always gets a real reaction in Canada when you say this, we have a real shortage of wealthy people in Canada. And so when you hear the government say, we're going to raise the top tax rate, and you think, well, there's actually only, 100,000 people in that category. And those are people who are actually really good at tax avoidance. The tax codes in this country are unbelievably, ridiculously complicated. I moved down to New Zealand a few years ago, and I remember the first year I got my tax form, and it was only a two-sided sheet of paper, and it essentially said, how much money did you make this year? How much money do you already pay in advance taxes? How much more do you owe? And that was it. You had no deductions, no exemptions, no this, no that, no manipulations that you need a very expensive accountant to actually help you figure out. And so it is time for a radical rethink. I mean, people will pay their share as long as they actually believe everybody is. And we know, Philip, I'm sure knows the number, but I think we have, 25 or 30% of Canadians who pay no taxes at all, except through, GSTs and PSTs. They don't pay any income tax at all. And if we think we're going to, excite people about business growth and development by threatening them with higher taxes, which is also the other story we're hearing out of Ottawa. We'll tax the rich. You hear the NDP talk about this a lot. That group is actually pretty sick and tired of being held up as the boogie people, the ones who are responsible for sort of difficulties. But we better reform the tax system. And what a better time to do that than, how do you use the crisis to good effect and say, okay, our distribution of income and our distribution of tax benefits are wrong. I would also really heartily endorse the idea of doing something for small business and doing it right now. Not something a year from now when we can add up the number of bankruptcies. Let the small business people know there's relief coming in a major way, and do it sooner rather than later.
I think that kind of brings us to a good transition point here, because when you talk about wages in terms of doing, especially for young people that are kind of just entering the job market, we're trying to figure out what we should expect in terms of our first salary and all that, and how to save and whatnot. So it kind of ties into the work that, Philip, you've been working on, especially in your last paper, The Truth About the Unemployment Rate. You mentioned that while statistical evidence from the last few decades saw an upward trend of wage growth among Canada, the employment rate has stagnated and at times kind of floundered. Will this change post-COVID? And what factors can influence the trend of this kind of slow wage growth? And what should young people know, or kind of trying to evaluate how much our first paycheck should be?
Yeah. Well, obviously, with record levels of unemployment, this is going to dampen wage increases in the foreseeable future. I'd even agree with Aaron. I think it's unavoidable that some of that is going to be transmitted into the public sector. I think the public sector unions quite rightly should be bracing themselves that they're going to be asked to share some of this pain. So in the short term, there's going to be a lot of downward pressure on wages. The one optimistic thing I would say about all of this is often we're in the middle, we're getting to hopefully the bottom of this crisis. Hopefully we won't have a second downward leg, but we will have a slow, choppy recovery. And it's very hard, when you're at the bottom of a big hole like this, it's very hard to see the light. But I would just remind people that it's often in these circumstances, during times when economies are shaken to the core, when they're in the depth of a deep recession, that some of our most innovative and creative companies have been created. Apple and Microsoft were born in 1975. Apple and Microsoft, Google and Amazon were created in 2001. So there's a lot of evidence that when a lot of firms are going to die, as they are, especially the small businesses, that does create a lot of opportunity for innovation, for new ways of doing things. So, I don't want to just press people. Yes, there's going to be a lot of downward pressure on incomes and wages, but people shouldn't lose sight of the fact, too, that there's going to be a lot of opportunities, at least in the longer term.
And this kind of ties into a question I just saw in the chat here for Aaron. While we're going through this pandemic, MPs and by extension senators actually gave themselves a bit of a pay raise. So the question here from one of our viewers is, leaders around the world, like the New Zealand Prime Minister, took a pay cut. And I kind of answered this for you, so my apologies. Did the Prime Minister take a pay cut, and did any of his MPs follow suit?
Well, no, and look, this is a classic case of a missed opportunity for them. It's just tone deaf. I mean, this is politics 101 for a politician. And to be fair to MPs, the pay raise was automatic. It kicked in on April 1st every year. It's not like they decided 2 weeks before to give themselves one, but they should have stopped it. To their credit, we actually asked them all to give up the pay raise, and about 200 out of the 338 agreed to donate their pay raise to charity. But look, there are other leaders. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is buddies with the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She's a good friend of his. She went out and took a pay cut and said, look, this is to show leadership and solidarity. We see it in Japan and India. They've been taking 20-30% pay cuts. So I think, look, there's already, it's trite now to say that there's quite a bit of lost faith between large sections of the public and elites or politicians in particular. And this would have been a very easy way for them to signal to regular people that they understand what they're going through. Frankly, if you're a member of parliament making 180 grand a year, you can afford to take a 20% pay cut. And that's not to say they're not doing work. Many of them are working very hard, but so are many people in the private sector. Many people in the private sector are working just as hard. They're being asked to do even more, but they've had to take a pay cut for the simple reason that there's no money to go around. And I think if politicians want to try and bring the public along with them as we go through some more painful times, it would be really good for them to reflect on how they can demonstrate personally that they're willing to put some skin in the game.
I have to kind of agree with you on that, and I think it's a little ridiculous that they see a pay bump when everyone else is kind of cutting back. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. A question here from a high school we have, and this is for everyone, so feel free to weigh in where you see fit. Will the pandemic and the subsequent recovery period affect income and wealth inequality in Canada?
I think there's no question in the short term it's made it worse. By the way, I should make it clear too that Canada didn't have the inequality problem that the U.S. did. The U.S. is quite exceptional. They have these large firms, for example, these technological juggernauts that are global brands, Amazon and Google and so on. Nobody else has firms like that, and nobody else has winner-take-all, very rich people like that. So the idea, we haven't had this concentration of wealth in the top 10% or 1%. But in fact, the inequality in this country has gone down over the last 10 years. But clearly, too, I mean, the people losing their jobs on the front lines of this are the least educated, least skilled people, waitresses and people in personal care. They're the ones that have lost their jobs, not lawyers and accountants and people at the top end of the income distribution. So in the short term, this is going to make inequality much worse, and that's going to be a real challenge going forward.
And just to pick up on that and go back to Philip's example from talking before about World War II, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, we had 27% unemployment rate across the country and all these catastrophic things. If you had a good job, and if you had a secure income, if you worked for Eaton's or if you worked for the Bank of Montreal or worked for different government agencies, your standard of living actually went up. Yeah. And what happens, and just to use an example out west here, there were lots of people who all of a sudden said, well, let's hire a couple of young ladies to come and live in the house and do the cleaning and do the cooking, and let's hire a young man to come and paint the house and do that sort of thing. That's actually what we're getting into now. And you're getting a situation where somebody else's misery, if you're doing well, actually creates greater opportunities. So as I sit here again in Saskatoon, there's all sorts of really interesting things going on with, closing out sales that are happening and those kinds of things, people who are desperate for work. So that actually, the crisis of one person becomes the opportunity for somebody else. And I want to reinforce something that Philip and Eric's both already said, that this does create opportunities. One of the things, you look around your town, you'll see all sorts of shop fronts that are now empty. Their landlords are desperate to find companies to open up, and they're looking for people to come in. We're going to see a lot of shaking around going on here. And one of the things that's going to be really interesting to see is the economic impact of working with a locally owned company is actually significantly higher than the economic impact of working with a chain store. So if you actually go into a local store, that local restaurant, for example, and go and buy your dinner from there, as opposed to buying it from McDonald's, the economic multipliers are actually significantly higher for the local store. They spend all their money locally. They don't get things bought through warehouses that are based in California. It's kind of an interesting phenomena. And I think one of the things we're going to have to think about is whether or not we sort of do that sort of look after Canada first mentality, which you're seeing happening in a lot of countries. It's certainly happening in Norway. And that's actually getting a bit of a nice boost in the economy with people saying, shop local, buy local, go to the local restaurants and things of that sort. So lots of inequality getting stronger. Philip's main point about the fact that we're not like the United States is very, very real. Absolutely true. But we better be careful because, when you get massive levels of inequalities, when you get unrest. And ironically, if you look historically, if the job losses are young women, that doesn't cause the same crisis as if it's young men. If young men can't get decent jobs out of high school and university, they become unruly. And it actually is a real source of sort of social dismay, which you can certainly see in many parts of the United States.
I'll just add to that, though, that we can't focus. I think we spent too much time over the last decade talking about income distribution and not about the creation of income. And I think that's one factor that led to the election of Trump. Despite, why would poor people, unemployed people vote for a billionaire? He promised to get the economy going again. And not enough people have talked about that. Too many people have talked about the top 1%, let's redistribute income. No, let's create income. And hopefully coming out of this crisis, we'll get back to focusing on the creation of income and stop worrying about these very destructive debates about, you got a little more than me and I'm going to tax you. And that's no way to run an economy.
Yeah, can I just quickly, Daniel, on inequality? I mean, I think, and Bill Watson and McGill wrote a really good book about this, about how so often the focus is on the top 1% rather than the people at the bottom. If you really are concerned about inequality, what you really mean is you're concerned about poverty. You're concerned about the people who don't have enough. But all the attention always seems to be focused on the people at the top and the sort of basic assumption that if you make the poor richer by making the rich poorer, which comes back to a different worldview. There's a worldview that a lot of people seem to just accept, which is there's only a certain amount of wealth in the world, and the government's job is to divide it up. Whereas there are others, including myself, who believe there is not a fixed amount of wealth. You can create more wealth. You can grow the pie, so to speak. And so many of the policies that we're seeing pushed today are about dividing up the pie, and there's nowhere near enough energy or thought being put into how to grow that pie. And I mean, there's evidence that shows that even in Canada, for example, there are provinces that have lower marginal income tax rates, have more wealthy people. And those more wealthy people pay more tax. And those provinces have more money to spend on public services. Why? Because they have policies in place that actually create more wealthy people. So, when people say, well, why are you worried about, a tax on the, it's not because I'm terribly concerned about the guy with 3 yachts. I mean, he's going to be okay. But I do worry about what the consequences are for the rest of us, for everybody else, if we have policies that are attacking those people and essentially chasing them away. If the result is that it's bad news for everybody else in Canada, then I think we need to be concerned about those policies.
It's going to be interesting you talked about that, especially, again, turning back to young people like myself. When we're looking at getting in the workforce during a recession, what impacts do you think will be out there that we will have to navigate before we can buy those 3 yachts and whatnot?
So I'll start with one thing, and you won't like this. Surveys that have been done of college and university students across the country tell us 2 things. One is that they expect too high a starting salary. And secondly, they expect to sort of have work-life balance in the very first instance. It's actually a pretty tough workplace out there. And companies, employers are looking for people who are going to work hard and work strong. They're not going to have somebody who, their first question they ask is, when do I take my first holiday? It is going to be tough to get yourself noticed in this particular environment. And so a couple of things I would say, get out of the big cities. There are actually more job opportunities, despite what I said about new jobs being created in the cities. There's lots of existing jobs being created in smaller towns. Go north, go west, go east, get out of the city. And take a look at other places. It's much easier and cheaper to live in those kind of places as you're sort of trying to break in. And I think that's a really important sort of starting point. Don't take anything for granted. Don't get frustrated and think you're being picked on, or that somehow the university lied to you, or the college lied to you, your parents lied to you. Nobody expected this particular crisis to come, and it was already really difficult. Even before this crisis, we had problems with people finding good career jobs. There aren't very many of them. We don't have enough big companies in this country. We've lost a whole bunch of the Hudson's Bays and the Simpson Sears and those kind of firms that used to have really good career opportunities. So when you look, a couple of years ago, we did a survey in Canada, and who's the number one employer? And the answer came back interesting. The number one employer was the government of Canada. which you wouldn't think. And why is that? Well, high salaries, guaranteed benefits, all that kind of stuff. The number 2 and number 3 favorite employees were Apple and Google, neither of whom had more than any handful of jobs in the country at the time. But this is just everybody's expectation. I want to go work in a place that has ping pong tables and free pasta. Those aren't the jobs. I would encourage people to get out there and talk to small business people who are getting their companies going again, starting up right now, looking for somebody willing to work with them and grow with them. I wouldn't use job boards. Only about 10% of jobs that are available ever get posted. Most of the jobs don't get posted, and if I was an employer, I'd want to hire somebody who went looking for me. But assume that it is going to be extremely tough, and you have to knock on a whole bunch of doors and sell yourself very aggressively.
Unfortunately, we do have a lot of research on this. You're not the first generation that's walked into the teeth of a very nasty job market. I mean, we saw people in the 1930s. If you happen to hit the job market in the 1930s, your lifetime income stream just never recovered. We saw in very severe recessions in 1982 and in the early 1990s, it took 10 years for people's incomes to recover. So you're going to take a hit. You're not the first ones. You didn't ask for it. You don't deserve it, but there it is. And you have to deal with it as best you can. And I think a lot of the advice Ken offered was, but eventually you do recover. After about 10 years, incomes go back to where they were for other cohorts. So eventually it'll recover, but it'll be a hard road ahead, no doubt about it.
Just being mindful of the time here, I'm just going to put one last question before we begin to wrap up. And most of the topics we've kind of discussed so far have kind of spelled bad news for this generation and the one to come after it. What advice would you have? And this might also be a good time to kind of give some concluding statements as well to young Canadians who are looking to survive this COVID crisis and then the recovery afterwards. How can we just hit the ground running, really?
So I'll jump in quickly since the other guys were waiting for a second. Number one, remember we're in a very fortunate country. In Australia, they always refer to their country as the lucky country. Canada's in the same boat. We're a very, very fortunate country. You don't have to, you do have your CERB payments. We're not letting people starve in the streets. So you're going to be in a place in this global pandemic and global recovery. Canada's a pretty darn good place to start with, right? I think I've talked before about investing in yourself does not necessarily mean running off and getting a university degree. It means finding out what you're good at and finding out where the economy is going. And I think, I'm quite nervous about sort of the future job losses associated with new technologies. Not because I know what's going to happen, because I don't know what's going to happen. So you don't know where those job losses and things are going to be. It turns out that one of the groups that's at greatest risk from technological change are actually doctors. And that's a group we've always thought was recession-proof and guaranteed jobs for life. So the world is very uncertain. Students have to be very, very flexible, and you have to know what's actually happening. And so I go back to something very simple, and it sounds like a really dumb thing. Ask yourself how much you read. A well-educated person is going to read 2 or 3 or 4 newspapers a day. They're going to read books on a regular basis from sort of the new cutting-edge thinkers. And if you haven't read Factfulness yet, Factfulness will make you more optimistic about the future than other books will actually do. If you haven't read the Second Machine Age, you aren't scared enough yet about where technology is going to do. So I would really encourage people to create your own future. If you're sitting here waiting for the parents and adults and politicians and government to create your future for you, you're making a losing bet. So bet on yourself, but create your own future by working hard toward it. And do not take anything for granted, because we just don't know what lies ahead.
Yeah, I'd follow that up by saying that one thing, I spent most of my life, 36 years in the public sector, and now the last 8 in the private sector. And one thing that's very striking, the difference between the public and private sectors, and there's a lot of differences, but one is the optimism, the positive outlook of people in the private sector. That these people have to believe in what they're doing. It's what motivates them to go to work every day. So that's something I think you have to bring to yourself, and you have to bring to when you interview with these people. Emphasize that. I don't think you can't just sit back and say, well, you know, this horrible thing has happened to us, and focus on the negative. Focus on the advantages. Think how bad this experience would have been if we hadn't had all this technology we developed recently that's allowed us to talk today. And if this had happened 10 years ago, it would have been a real mental health crisis in this country, a real disaster to the economy. So for every generation has its challenges, but every generation has its advantages too, and focus on those.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just to echo both Ken and Philip, that I think we need to keep some perspective. I mean, there are always going to be challenging times for any generation. This is the moment for young people today. There are far worse times and places that you could be. I mean, I have spent time in some when I was a student about 20 years ago, I spent a few months living in Cambodia, which is a very poor country. And it was a real eye-opener for me because people there, I mean, you take for granted things like running water and electricity, basic amenities. Some people in the world still don't have those things. And I know that's cold comfort to a lot of people that are used to living a comfortable life, but perspective is called for. There is going to be a better tomorrow. The other thing I'd say is to be flexible when you're young. I mean, I've had jobs when I was in high school. I delivered papers, I washed dishes, I mopped floors. It was not a glamorous job. It did not pay well, but boy, it taught me how to work, and it taught me the importance of hard work. And you know, it's not always about the dollar value of the job, especially earlier in your career. So just to be flexible, take work where you can get it, and you know, as you build up experience and skills, opportunities will come. Especially as Ken says, if you start looking for them.
That's really great advice, especially like taking that away, and I hope all the viewers take that into. Just before we conclude, what is the best way to reach each of you? This is a great opportunity to plug your social media or the social media of MLI or anything like that. So I'll let you guys take it from here.
Well, if anybody want to reach out to me personally, my email address is kennethcoates@gmail.com. I encourage you, if you have any questions at all, just reach out to me. And I would really encourage you to sort of follow the work at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We stay on top of domestic, international, Indigenous economic affairs. Just being able to read Philip Cross's work on a regular basis will make you one of the most informed Canadians around. Philip has an incredible insight into how the economy is evolving, and would just start to read and pay attention. Macdonald-Laurier is a great place to start.
Yeah, my email is philip.cross@Macdonald-Laurier, or of course you can just contact the Institute and they'll put you in touch with me.
And us, you can read about the Taxpayers Federation at taxpayer.com or drop me a line at federal.director@taxpayer.com.
Muted. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Philip. I think this is a great place to end it, just to remind people that they can access any of this content again, because we'll be posting it to our social media channels. I would like to thank MLI, CTF, and GS for coming together to organize this, especially Chris from GS and Brett from MLI. And I look forward to talking to everyone again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right. All right, now we can go for Gears Bike.
Whoops.